I was sitting in the back of a high-stakes engineering meeting at a tech startup recently. The room was packed with senior developers, the kind of people who practically dream in algorithms. They were discussing this really complicated migration, drawing these complex interlocking diagrams all over the whiteboard.
I can picture it.
Then this terrified 19-year-old intern, maybe 3 weeks into his first professional gig, he raises his hand.
Oh, boy.
The room goes completely quiet. He points to this intricate architecture diagram and asks, in total sincerity, why don't we just put all the code into one single file so it's easier to find?
Oh, the classic question. You could hear a pin drop, I bet.
You could practically feel the collective eye roll in the room. I mean, it was the definition of a foolish question. It's naive, technically absurd, and just ignores decades of accumulated knowledge about software architecture.
Right. It goes against every principle they live by.
Exactly. And I fully expected the CTO, a veteran of several billion-dollar exits, to just laugh him out of the room or, condescendingly explain the basics of separation of concerns.
Which is what would happen 99% of the time.
But then the whole dynamic shifted completely.
Oh, okay.
The CTO didn't laugh. She didn't lecture. She just stared at the board for a long, really uncomfortable minute. And her expression changed from initial annoyance to this deep, focused concentration. Finally, she taps the marker against the wall and she just mutters, if the structure is this opaque to a fresh set of eyes, our dependency graph has become a disaster.
Wow.
That one dumb question didn't result in a lecture about why he was wrong. It triggered a complete system-wide audit of their architecture's complexity.
That's incredible. She saw the signal in the noise?
She saw the signal in the noise. And that moment, the master extracting diagnostic gold from a novice's confusion, that really encapsulates the mission for this deep dive.
I love that framing.
We're investigating this exact paradox. How can the deepest expert learn from the rawest beginner? So we need to unpack the psychology behind it, right? The inherent disadvantages of expertise, the liberating power of intellectual humility.
And how strategic questioning can turn that confusion into clarity.
Exactly. Across corporate boardrooms, academic lecture halls, you name it. Our goal today is to really investigate how leaders can build a culture that encourages these foolish questions.
And transform them from these awkward moments into really catalysts for innovation.
Right, because that initial impulse you just identified, that universal collective eye roll, that's the biggest barrier to getting better.
It is an absolutely essential investigation because the core conflict isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a kind of cognitive and psychological rigidity.
Okay, so why? Why do experts, people whose whole identity is tied to their knowledge, react so defensively to input that challenges their view, especially from someone less experienced?
That's the critical question. It really boils down to two major forces. First, the inherent cognitive limitations that just come with deep specialization. And second, the intense social pressure to maintain their status as an expert.
Let's start with the cognitive side. What do you mean by limitations?
Well, it involves two big ideas, the curse of knowledge and what's called cognitive entrenchment.
The curse of knowledge. I've heard that one. It's when you know something so well you can't imagine what it's like not to know it.
That's it exactly. Experts have organized their knowledge so densely, so efficiently in their own minds, that they genuinely struggle to reconstruct the beginner's mind. They forget the foundational steps.
And that leads to this entrenchment.
Yes. That entrenchment leads to inflexibility. Their mental maps are super optimized for a very specific terrain. So when the environment changes or when they have to explain a concept to a novice, it's incredibly difficult.
Like a professor who's a genius in their field but a terrible introductory teacher.
A perfect example. Studies show that when an expert teaches a foundational concept, they skip vital steps. They assume the novice knows certain terms or connections that are just second nature to them.
Which forces the novice to keep asking these, basic questions.
Right. And the expert often perceives that as tedious or a waste of time, failing to see that it's their own teaching, their own explanation that's limited.
So the expert is kind of trapped by the efficiency of their own brain. But you also mentioned social pressure. That feels, much more high stakes.
Oh, it is. Hugely. Beyond the cognitive side, there is immense social pressure to maintain superior performance, credibility, and reputation.
You have to act like an expert.
You have to act like one consistently. And this pressure pushes people, especially in leadership roles, toward adopting what researchers call a performance goal orientation, or PGO.
Okay, let's unpack PGO. If success is the goal, How does focusing on performance become a bad thing?
Because PGO means your main motivation is external validation. You're seeking recognition, you're trying to prove your competence, and you're avoiding anything that might signal weakness or ignorance.
Ah, so you're prioritizing the appearance of success over the actual process of learning.
Exactly. If your main goal is to show everyone that you're all-knowing, then any question you can't immediately answer or any input that suggests your current plan is flawed becomes an existential threat.
It's a threat to your identity.
It is, and that makes experts incredibly risk-averse. They fear making mistakes, trying new things, and most critically, admitting they have limits.
So they can't say, I don't know.
It's very difficult. Decades of research from people like Chris Argyris show that socially, inconsistency like changing your mind or admitting an error isn't seen as growth. It's often perceived as being incompetent or irrational.
That reinforces all these defensive walls they put up.
Totally. They feel this enormous pressure to seem confident because reputation is so fragile. And this often leads them to be really reluctant to seek feedback, especially from novices or people lower on the totem pole.
Because asking for help might disrupt that carefully built image of competence.
You got it.
This just perfectly frames that scene with the tech intern. The senior developer's immediate impulse was pure PGO.
Absolutely. Protect the knowledge hierarchy, affirm the complexity of our system, and dismiss the challenge from the outside.
The default, rigid response would have been to lecture the intern on separation of concerns and all the architectural patterns he didn't know.
And that response protects the expert status. It upholds the PGO model perfectly. But like you said, the real issue wasn't the intern's ignorance.
No, the problem he accidentally exposed was that the system's overfragmentation had created this spaghetti diagram of microservices.
Which was causing real expensive latency issues.
Exactly. The data was jumping around way too much. So the naive question was actually a perfect, status-free diagnostic tool that the entrenched experts couldn't see.
They were too close to it.
They were too close to the trees. The CTO's refusal to lecture and her decision to pivot the meeting to refactor based on that underlying issue, that shows a crucial pivot away from PGO.
And that pivot is so rare because the failure to adapt, thanks to that PGO mindset, creates a really devastating organizational problem. It's often called the doom loop.
The doom loop. Okay, what's that?
When people whose identity is heavily performance-oriented encounter a failure, a project goes south, a system crashes, they react defensively.
Instead of reflecting on what went wrong.
Instead of learning, they attribute the failure externally.
They blame others. The clients didn't know what they wanted, the novices messed up the deployment, the market changed.
Precisely. It's defensive reasoning at its core. You prioritize protecting your image over solving the root problem.
And that's a self-limiting feedback loop. It just prevents any real learning.
It traps the expert in a cycle of rigidity. And it means the more demanding the situation, the deeper the fear of failure, and the less likely they are to learn from mistakes or from any input that challenges their competence.
And if they don't blame others, they often just retreat into overconfidence. There's this tendency towards, egocentric advice discounting.
Yes, that's a critical psychological mechanism. Experts, because they're so confident in their deep knowledge, tend to heavily overweight their own opinions and actively underweight the input of others.
Regardless of how good that input is.
Regardless of the quality, they become so self-assured that they resist being dependent on external feedback, which paradoxically actually reduces their judgment accuracy over time. They mistake high confidence for high accuracy.
So expertise, when it's unchecked, becomes its own kind of cognitive trap.
It leads to rigidity and inflexibility, not sustained high performance.
Okay, so the problem is clearly defined. PGO, the curse of knowledge, this self-reinforcing doom loop. If those are the obstacles, what's the antidote? What's the virtue that unlocks the master's ability to hear the gold in the noise?
The antidote is intellectual humility, IH for short.
Intellectual humility.
It is absolutely fundamental to adaptability and sustained high performance. And it's the direct counter to the defensive reasoning of that PGO mindset.
Okay, but how do we define that beyond just being modest or admitting you made a typo? That sounds like general humility. We need something more specific for intellectual flexibility.
That distinction is crucial. You're right. IH is best understood not as a moral trait like modesty, but as a cognitive virtue.
That's cognitive virtue.
And even more importantly, a metacognitive ability.
Okay, metacognitive.
Yeah.
So thinking about your own thinking.
Exactly. It's the capacity to accurately recognize the limits of your own knowledge and your own beliefs. It's the ability to assess what you know, what you don't know, and to adjust your confidence level accordingly.
So it's not about being arrogant or insecure. It's about being accurate.
It occupies that perfectly balanced position. It's the middle ground between two extremes. Intellectual arrogance, where you claim more certainty than you should.
And intellectual diffidence, where you claim less knowledge than you have and don't act.
Precisely. IH is simply the accurate, open self-assessment of your own cognitive landscape.
So it's less about saying I don't know anything and more about asking, how would I know if I'm wrong?
That is the core question. The main components of IH are, first, having an accurate view of yourself and your cognitive limits. Second, being genuinely open to feedback, no matter where it comes from. Third, truly appreciating others' contributions. And fourth, as you said, having the willingness to ask that uncomfortable question. How would I know if I were wrong?
So the pursuit of truth has to become more important than your reputation.
That's the fundamental trade-off.
And that shift prioritizing truth over that PGO-driven reputation, that seems like the only way an organization can really grow, especially in fields that are changing every day.
It's the gateway to adaptability. Humble teams and individuals are just inherently less dogmatic. They resist new information less fiercely.
They see change as an opportunity, not a threat.
Exactly. They see a cognitive challenge as a chance for growth and innovation. In our complex, interconnected world, just being willing to acknowledge that other people have necessary knowledge is vital just to function, let alone to excel.
This plays out so dramatically in fields like design and user experience, where an expert's idea of what is logical often clashes directly with actual human intuition.
Oh, absolutely.
Which brings us to this story of the unsophisticated user. I find this one so powerful because it's about life-critical technology. So this involved a medical device company. They were developing this cutting-edge home dialysis machine.
Okay, so high stakes.
Very high stakes. It's designed for complex treatments, but it has to be simple enough for elderly patients to use at home. So the engineers had created this technically perfect system, slick interface, complex readouts, modern touchscreen.
I can see it. Very clean, very Apple-esque.
Totally. But during user testing with an elderly patient, they watched her consistently bypass the on-screen pause icon and instead press the large physical red emergency stop button every time she needed to just briefly interrupt the treatment.
So to go to the bathroom or answer the door, she's hitting the big red button.
Every single time.
And the engineer's reaction, let me guess, was not positive.
It was classic PGO. They were utterly frustrated. Their conclusion was that the user was using the machine wrong and just hadn't read the manual carefully enough.
They blamed the user, a clear sign of intellectual arrogance.
Total lack of IH. They believed their expertise defined the user's reality. And that's where the project lead stepped in, with some real wisdom. He didn't see a foolish user, he saw failed design.
He had the humility to see her behavior as valuable feedback.
Exactly. He didn't focus on what she did, but why she did it. And he realized that in a moment of high anxiety, you're hooked up to tubes. Your blood is flowing through a machine. A large physical red button feels inherently safe. It feels real and immediately reliable.
Much more trustworthy than a small abstract icon on a glass screen that might not register your tap.
Exactly. The engineers were being intellectually arrogant, assuming their digital logic was better than human intuition under stress. The project lead was intellectually humble.
He recognized that the design failed to account for a critical human factor: anxiety and the need for physical, tactile control.
So instead of trying to force the user to adapt to the technology,
they adapted the technology to the user's intuition.
They stopped trying to re-educate the patient, and they redesigned the system. The physical emergency button now functioned as a safe pause when the machine was running smoothly, but it still acted as an emergency stop if things went wrong.
That is profound. It shows that true organizational learning means deriving value from what seems like unsophisticated feedback, especially when it challenges the expert's core assumptions.
It's everything.
Because when an expert's ego is running the show, they ignore that feedback. They lecture the user, and they maintain a flawed system.
But when intellectual humility is part of the culture, they use that feedback to find a fatal flaw in their own design.
Which leads directly to a stronger product and deeper institutional learning.
And this humility must have a huge impact on team dynamics, right? If the leader is humble, it must just open the floodgates for input from everyone else.
Absolutely. Intellectual humility is crucial for fostering the most essential ingredient in any high-performing team, which is psychological safety.
Psychological safety. So feeling safe to speak up.
It's creating an atmosphere where individuals, whether they're a new engineer, a line worker, even a nurse in an operating room, feel safe to express a dissenting opinion, to raise a concern, to admit an error without fear of being punished or humiliated.
And when you have that, the team benefits exponentially.
You get a much richer pool of perspectives. People are willing to share unconventional or half-baked ideas, which strengthens the team's critical thinking capacity.
But without IH from the top, that critical input just stays silent.
It stays silent, trapped by fear of ridicule or, career damage.
So IH isn't just about being a nice person. It's a genuine performance enhancer.
It's a catalyst for performance. And what's more, IH is strongly intertwined with perspective taking.
The ability to see things from another's point of view.
And to genuinely appreciate viewpoints that are fundamentally different from your own. The research consistently shows that intellectually humble people are far better at perspective taking.
Which leads to more empathy, better communication.
Especially when you're dealing with complex, ambiguous problems. Humility, when it's combined with professional resilience, is what differentiates the leaders who get stuck from the leaders who stay open to new possibilities and sustain their excellence.
Let's turn our attention specifically to leadership then, because when this trait comes from the top, it becomes a systemic lever. We're talking about intellectual humility leadership, or IHL.
Right, and how it impacts the modern workforce, especially the newer generations.
So IHL, is that just a fancy term for a humble boss?
It's a powerful concept because it has a distinctive cognitive core. That's what sets it apart from general humility.
How so?
Well, general humility is more about moral and interpersonal things, like admitting mistakes or being modest about your achievements. IHL, on the other hand, is specifically about the leader's willingness to acknowledge their own cognitive limits.
They admit they don't know everything.
And to maintain genuine intellectual openness and, critically, to be willing to revise their strategic views and decisions based on new evidence.
So it's about the leader publicly modeling the pursuit of evidence over the pursuit of just being right.
That's the perfect summary.
So how does IHL strategically benefit an organization? The sources we looked at frame this using two big frameworks: job demands resources theory, JDR, and social exchange theory, SA.
That's right. IHL operates as a really powerful dual mechanism. So let's start with JDR theory.
Okay.
This framework basically says that employees face job demands like stress and workload, and they have job resources like support and autonomy, which help them cope.
And IHL acts as a resource.
It acts as a critical job resource. By showing cognitive openness and inviting input, an IHL leader is actively providing support, fostering autonomy, and creating that psychological safety we talked about.
So it's a buffer against burnout and stress.
Exactly. By giving employees resources to cope and grow, IHL stimulates this positive motivational process that promotes thriving at work.
Which is what exactly? Feeling good at your job.
It's the simultaneous, sustained experience of vitality, energy, and continuous learning. Employees feel like they have the cognitive space to experiment and grow because the leader has lowered the fear of failure.
Okay, so that's the JDR model. What about social exchange theory? SET.
Under SET, IHL acts as a powerful social signal. A leader who openly admits their limits, seeks input from subordinates, and shows a real willingness to change their mind that signals openness, fairness, benevolence.
So employees see that as a positive investment from the leader, a sign of respect.
A sign of respect and trust. And according to SET, employees then reciprocate that positive social investment.
With higher commitment, more effort.
And ultimately, enhanced performance. They feel valued, so they invest more themselves back into the relationship and the work.
This feels uniquely tailored to the expectations of millennials and Gen Z. They're often looking for meaningful work, self-development, that kind of psychological alignment.
It is precisely what they're looking for. IHL directly addresses their need for self-development and self-actualization. A leader who questions their own views and invites robust input fosters a culture of inclusiveness and psychological safety, which is a critical resource for these generations.
And the research confirms this link between IHL and outcomes like thriving and performance.
It does, but there's a fascinating nuance. The relationship is primarily indirect.
Indirect. So IHL doesn't just instantly boost performance on its own.
No, there's a middle step. And that middle step is absolutely vital. It's mediated by positive work attitudes.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means IHL works by first cultivating a foundation of positive attitudes, things like job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and just genuine optimism about your career prospects at that company.
So that's the central mechanism. IHL improves the work environment, which creates these positive attitudes.
And then those positive attitudes are what drive the thriving and, subsequently, the performance.
So if the employees aren't satisfied or committed, the leader's humility won't really translate into better work.
Exactly. The attitude is the necessary bridge between the leadership style and the organizational outcome.
Okay, let's add the final fascinating layer here, which is the role of the employee's own internal resources, specifically their core self-evaluation, or CSE.
Right. This acts as a critical boundary condition. It changes how effective IHL can be.
So CSE is basically your intrinsic self-confidence, your belief in your own competence and control.
It's a stable personality trait, yes. And the effectiveness of IHL depends significantly on where an employee sits on that CSE spectrum.
So who benefits more from a humble leader? The highly confident employee or the less confident one?
The research shows it benefits both, but in very different ways. For high CSE employees who already have strong self-efficacy and a sense of control, IHL creates an amplification effect.
An amplification effect.
They're better equipped to recognize, absorb, and act on the resources, the psychological safety, the autonomy that the leader is providing through their humility.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. Imagine a high CSE employee getting feedback from an IHL leader who says, look, I might be wrong about the market next quarter, but based on this new data, how should we adapt our plan?
Okay.
The high CSE employee, already confident, takes that open environment and runs with it. They translate the leader's openness into even stronger positive attitudes, which results in higher thriving and performance. They're ready to fully use the resources the leader's humility provides.
And what about the low CSE employees?
Yeah.
The ones who might struggle with self-doubt?
For them, IHL provides a crucial compensatory effect.
Compensatory, so it makes up for something?
Exactly. These employees lack the internal resources to fully thrive on their own. So the support, the safety, the explicit invitation to contribute that's offered by the humble leader, it partially offsets their own lack of confidence.
The leader's humility becomes an external resource for them.
It helps them develop the positive work attitudes they might otherwise struggle to build. Now, the effect on performance is slightly reduced compared to the high CSE group because they still have to overcome their own internal limitations.
But it's still there. It's still a net positive.
It's still present, and it's still critical. The IHL acts as a buffer, helping to compensate for the negative impact of their low internal resources. So in sum, IHL is this incredibly adaptive leadership style that improves outcomes across the entire spectrum of employee confidence.
That makes IHL incredibly robust. It's not a soft skill. It's a foundational management lever that stabilizes performance across a diverse workforce.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, let's shift context completely and look at how this idea, extracting wisdom from confusion, is institutionalized in education. We're moving from the corporate world to the lecture hall and to the ancient art of the Socratic method.
A perfect transition.
This takes us back to the story of the macroeconomics professor, a Nobel laureate famous for his challenging teaching style, and a student who hadn't quite grasped the basic principles of monetary policy. The student posed what seemed like the most naive question possible.
Okay.
He said, if the government has debt, why don't we just print the exact amount they owe, pay it off immediately, and then stop printing? That way, we eliminate the debt and we don't have long-term inflation.
Oh, wow. The room must have snickered at that.
They did. It's a simplification that just completely ignores inflation and the whole concept of money as a store of value.
So the PGO-driven professor, the one only concerned with looking smart, would have just shut that down immediately.
Right. A quick technical lecture on hyperinflation, embarrass the student, confirm the expertise hierarchy, and move on.
But this professor's strategy was masterful.
It was. He showed profound intellectual humility by treating the flawed premise with total seriousness. He didn't just correct the student. He used that specific error as a foundation to build understanding for the entire class.
He built the lesson around the mistake.
Exactly. He responded, let's play that scenario out step by step. You print the money today, what happens to the supply? And crucially, what happens to the price of bread tomorrow morning?
Ah, I love that. So practical.
And he spent the entire lecture using that single flawed premise, the student's misconception, to force the whole class to dismantle their own assumptions about currency, value, and debt, building a comprehensive economic model from the ground up.
The naive input serves the perfect starting point for a masterclass in why.
That's Socratic questioning in its purest form.
It is. It's a structured, active learning strategy that involves dialogue specifically designed to develop critical thinking skills. It demands clarification, it forces students to articulate their hidden assumptions, and it compels them to rigorously test their own hypotheses.
So the effective educator, just like the wise CTO or the empathetic project lead, has the intellectual openness to exploit the error rather than just correct it.
That's the key. They exploit the error for learning.
What makes this method so crucial in pedagogy, especially in really rigorous subjects like science and engineering?
The primary reason is that deeply rooted misconceptions are the single biggest barrier to genuine long-term learning.
I see.
Students often succeed on tests by just using rote learning, memorizing steps, algorithms, the correct way to get to an answer without ever internalizing the underlying concepts.
They can do the math, but they can't explain the principle.
They can solve the calculation, but they cannot explain the why. And that's a form of expertise trap, just at the student level.
There was a study that looked at this, right, in chemical engineering.
Yes, a compelling one. They compared one group of students trained extensively in Socratic questioning with a control group who got traditional instruction.
And what did they find?
They found that the Socratic group performed just as well on calculation-typed questions. Both groups could work the algorithms.
But what about the conceptual understanding? That's the key.
And that's where the marked gap appeared. There was a profound performance difference on conceptual typed questions. The group trained in Socratic methods showed a much stronger ability to explain the fundamental principles and the why behind the math.
So their knowledge was deeper, not just procedural.
Much deeper. The Socratic method gives students a platform to identify, confront, and dismantle their own internal misconceptions. It lets them reconstruct their knowledge meaningfully.
It sounds like a hard way to learn, though. Did the students take to it easily?
They found it very challenging, which really speaks to how deep our culture of rote learning goes. The study noted that students initially struggled. They cited difficulty in coming up with questions to ask.
That's powerful evidence right there.
It is. It shows they needed time and training just to shift their mindset from passively receiving information to actively engaging in metacognitive learning, thinking about their own thinking. The process is uncomfortable because it forces you to shine a light on the limits of your own knowledge.
So if someone wants to use this method in a meeting, a design review, a classroom, what are the key categories of Socratic questions? How do you structure it?
The method involves 6 core types of questions, and they're designed to systematically challenge the accuracy and completeness of any line of thought.
Okay, what's the first type?
First, you have questions for clarification. These demand detail and precision. So things like, can you rephrase that to clarify what you meant? Or can you give me a concrete example of that principle in action?
Got it. Just making sure everyone is on the same page. What's next?
Second are questions that probe assumptions. These are vital because they challenge the hidden premises in our logic. For example, what is being assumed when you say the market is rational?
Or in the engineering context, why are we assuming the heat transfer area is perpendicular to the flow? What happens if that's wrong?
Exactly. Third are questions that probe reasons and evidence. This forces accountability. What specific data do you have to support that conclusion? Or can you prove how this mechanism works from first principles?
Okay, so clarification, assumptions, evidence. What's number 4?
Fourth, questions about viewpoints and perspectives. This opens the door to that intellectual humility by forcing you to consider alternatives. What is another completely different way to look at this problem?
Right. And then what?
Fifth, questions that probe implications and consequences. This projects the idea forward, testing its viability. If we adopt this policy, what would be the long-term unintended consequences? Or what would this affect 3 years from now that we haven't considered?
That's a big one.
And finally, a classic Socratic practice, you question the question itself.
Metacognition again.
Yes, why did I ask this question in the first place? Or what was the purpose of this line of inquiry? This whole sequence pushes you beyond simple answers and into deep, critical, reflective thinking.
That structure basically institutionalizes intellectual humility. It makes exploring your own limitations a core part of the process, whether you're a professor or a manager.
It does.
Which moves us beyond just individual learning strategies toward a system-level solution. Inquiry-based learning, or IBL.
Right. IBL expands on the Socratic approach by making the student's own questions the driving force of the entire learning environment, not just an occasional exercise.
It's a full pedagogical strategy. And there's some compelling evidence about its impact on critical thinking, right? From a big meta-analysis.
Yes, a recent systematic review that consolidated findings across 36 rigorous studies. It showed a substantial mean effect size, an SMD of 1.27 for IBL on critical thinking skills.
Okay, let's translate that. An SMD of 1.27, how big is that really?
Yeah.
In educational research, an effect size above 0.8 is generally considered a large effect. So 1.27 is profound. It means the average student in an IBL group scored about 1.27 standard deviations higher on critical thinking tests than the average student in a traditional control group.
Wow. Okay, so that's a massive, significant positive impact.
It's huge.
But the source highlighted that there was a lot of variation, that IBL isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
That's a vital point. The analysis showed what's called substantial heterogeneity. Basically, it means context matters a lot. We need to look at the moderator analysis to see where IBL is most powerful.
So let's break down those contexts. What about education level? Where does it work best?
It had the strongest influence by far at the undergraduate level. The SMD there was an astronomical 2.66.
Whoa.
It was still effective everywhere else, middle school, high school, even elementary, but the effect amplified massively in higher education.
Why do you think that is?
It suggests that students who have a certain baseline of knowledge are uniquely poised to benefit. They have more assumptions to rigorously challenge.
That makes sense. What about subject matter? Does it work better for certain sciences?
Yes, the effects varied by discipline. Physics showed a very strong effect, an SMD of 2.27, followed closely by chemistry at 1.58.
So fields where understanding the conceptual why is everything.
Exactly. Disciplines where the underlying laws are paramount, not just solving prescribed problems. It really reinforces that IBL is ideal for fostering that deep conceptual understanding.
The meta-analysis also looked at the media used for learning, which I found fascinating.
The findings there were extremely revealing. Traditional media, like books, showed a decent positive effect.
An SMD of about 1.0.
Right, but highly interactive digital media showed a much, much stronger influence. Specifically, things like digital games and simulations.
And the effect size there was?
It was an SMD of 3.98.
Almost 4.0. That's enormous.
It really is. It indicates that interactive digital media provides this powerful environment for students to hypothesize, test, fail safely, and get immediate feedback.
It surpasses static resources by a huge margin.
The ability to model concepts dynamically just enhances the learning process exponentially.
And finally, how you assess critical thinking seems crucial. If you teach students to question deeply, you can't just test them on simple recall.
That is the critical final step. The assessment type really influenced the results. Assessments requiring deep explanation, like essays, showed a strong effect.
An SMD of about 1.95.
Yes, which confirms that asking students to articulate complex arguments is a good test. But what was surprising is that closed-ended questions also showed a very strong effect size, an SMD of 3.04.
That is surprising. How can that be?
It suggests that if those questions are designed carefully, not as simple multiple-choice recall, but requiring deep conceptual application, problem diagnosis, or complex inference, they can be a highly effective way to measure the critical thinking that IBL fosters.
So the overall data really supports IBL as a system-level strategy for creating independent analytical learners.
Exactly the kind of people that modern organizations need.
This entire deep dive, it feels like it all brings us back to one singular, powerful conclusion. One that links corporate architecture, medical device design, and macroeconomic pedagogy. The greatest wisdom doesn't reside in the ability to deliver the perfect, unchallengeable answer. It's in the capacity to cultivate radical receptiveness, even to input that seems absurd or naive or foolish.
The research supports that strategic shift completely, whether it's that CTO decoding system latency from an intern's idea,
Or a project lead seeing a failed design and a patient's wrong usage.
or a professor building an entire economic model from a student's flawed premise. The lesson is universal.
We have to actively, institutionally, demote the image of the all-knowing expert who's operating under that performance goal orientation.
That's the real task.
Because intellectual humility is the primary differentiator. It's the strategic advantage that separates the experts who stagnate, the ones who get trapped in that doom loop by their own certainty, from the experts who stay cognitively flexible, adaptive, and capable of sustained high performance.
Because they can learn from any source. Organizations and individuals, they have to institutionalize these opportunities for critical thinking and feedback seeking, regardless of where that feedback comes from.
If you let PGO dominate, you just fall victim to that egocentric advice discounting.
You fail to learn. And eventually, you fail to adapt to a changing environment. Humility provides that necessary cognitive and psychological space.
The space to acknowledge you don't have all the answers.
That other possibilities exist and that someone else, however inexperienced, might have the better idea.
Or at least the critical question that needs to be asked.
That capacity to learn from anything, that's the true measure of intellectual strength.